Whenever I have a couple come in who is involved in marriage preparation, in the very first meeting, I'll ask them a pretty simple question right when we sit down, and that is, tell me about yourself, to ask each one of the parties. First of all, it's a good way for me to find out about them, kind of check some of the information on the sheet, take a few notes about where they grew up, about their family life, their education, their occupation. Also, it's a chance to be able to maybe see if they mention faith in any place, if they have been a Catholic all their life, or the importance of faith within their life. I kind of call it a spiel, like give me what your spiel is, or your elevator conversation. Everybody really should have some sort of elevator conversation, and it's like a 1 or 2 minute kind of thing. If they start going on longer than that, we sort of cut it down a little bit and kind of trim it. I found out enough about them at that point. But each one of us probably does have some kind of way when we introduce ourselves to someone for the first time, we give some background. It tells about our history, it tells about who we are as a person, also says how we see ourselves maybe in the context of the world. I think it's important for us to make sure we know who we are, because first of all, if we know who we are, we have a better way of relating to God. I think that's what we're all about here this morning to begin with on this Sunday morning. You could be in many different places today, but you've made a decision. God has called you to be here at 10 o'clock Mass, to be in this place in this time, to hear His word, and to also be able to receive the beauty of His real presence. So really, for each one of us who are here today, we have to have a sense of who we are and who we are in relationship to God. Today, in our gospel reading, we have Jesus asking the question of, how did people identify Him? How was it that they saw Him? And it wasn't that He was having an amnesia attack or didn't know who He was. It wasn't that He was insecure or concerned about, are people talking behind my back? That really had nothing to do with it. Christ wouldn't have been worried about that. It was that He wanted to know probably if His ministry was being effective. Were people really seeing Him for who He was? Think about it. This is the 16th chapter of Matthew's gospel here. So by this point, we've had miracles. People were healed. We had wonderful ministry being done by the Lord, great relationship going on. And so really at this point, He probably was wondering, do people see Him as a magician? Do they see Him as a medicine man or a healer? How do they view Him? And, He got a pretty good response. They said, well, some people think you're John the Baptist. Some people say Elijah. Some say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Well, they were on the right track there. At least they realized He was a man of faith. But when Jesus said to Peter, He asks him specifically. He specifically looks at Peter and He says, who do you say that I am? And Peter had the right answer. Peter said, well, you are the Messiah. You are the Savior. For thousands of years, people had waited for this Messiah. They'd waited for a Savior. So for Peter to recognize that, what a beautiful moment for Jesus. For Peter to say, you are who you are. I know you. I see your goodness. I see why God has sent you. You're the Savior of the world. You are the Messiah. You are the Christ, and Christ is not Jesus' last name. It means the Anointed One or the Messiah. So we have this wonderful identification of who Jesus is. And because Peter gives such a wonderful response, Jesus responds back to him. And He gives him an identity, changes his name. That seems to happen a lot in the Scriptures. And He says, you are Peter, and upon you I will form the church. The word Peter in Greek and in the classical languages means like a rock, a stone, something that's very hard, something that's very solid. It was really appropriate because in that particular place that they were, Caesarea Philippi, it's about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee. It's a beautiful spot. It's right kind of on the border of Lebanon and Syria and Israel. Beautiful spot, kind of like almost like the Grand Canyon, but very, very sad. It's a place where there's a lot of unrest, where there's an awful lot of turmoil. But in that spot, Jesus was there speaking with the apostles, and behind him was this huge wall. It's about 100 feet tall and about 500 feet wide, a natural stone. So it was really right on target for Jesus to be standing there in this place where for hundreds of years people had come for pagan worship. They had come there in order to bring their little statues, put it in the niches in the rock wall to their pagan gods. The Jewish people associated the place with death. Jesus came to bring life. So maybe Jesus was also testing the apostles to see and to ensure that they were faithful and loyal to him, that they were not loyal to these pagan gods that were around. But no, they saw him as who they were going to identify with. So we have the beginning of the church, death to life, paganism to the beauty of the divine, the wonderful ability to relate to Jesus as a person. And today, my friends, Jesus asks us that question. Who do you say that I am? And for as many hundreds of people who are in this church today, we would have as many answers. At least I hope so, because you could give a very academic answer. You could go back to the Bible and repeat what Peter said. You are the Savior, you're the Messiah, you are the Anointed One. But really, what is the answer in our heart? When we think about identifying with someone, how do we see Jesus? I mentioned I ask married couples. Maybe I could ask you, you're married 50 years, I think, today or yesterday. I could ask you, how do you identify with one another? If you were to describe not only yourself, but maybe I should have the couples, when they come in, tell me about their intended spouse. Tell me as much as you can about them. I wonder what they would say. Might be kind of a learning experience. Because our answer to those kind of questions is less about the other person, and it's more about us. Maybe today, think about each of the people in your family. If you live alone, think about maybe those who are away from you or someone who is close to you. Maybe it would be a nice thing to sit around the dinner table tonight, and each person sitting there at the table, and I hope you have a dinner table conversation, that it's not, as I mentioned last week, breaking out the cell phones and being #rude, but instead you are relating to one another, that you are sitting there, you're talking to one another. Maybe go around the table and each person say something about every other person at the table. I know in my family, we used to have to go around the table, and every so often we would do this, especially in long car trips. We would do this on the way to Florida from New York. We would have to say what we liked about each other person, and also we could say something that we didn't like about each of the other people at the table. Well, we didn't have World War III in the Parks household where we still talk to one another 30, 40 years later. But how do we describe the other people in our family? That nucleus, that what happens there is going to be so important about what happens outside of there in the larger community, at school, work, neighborhood. How do we identify with one another? And maybe then, when we see how we relate to people who are in front of us, who we live with each day, maybe then and only then are we able to then speak about who Jesus is. Who do we say that Jesus is? I ask you today, look around you at others and see who other people are to you, and then and only then think about who Jesus is, and give him an answer and a response from the heart.